Good evening, everyone. Happy Wednesday. It is April 21st, 2010, and thanks so much for joining us here tonight at Truth Brigade on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Hope you all are having a beautiful day, and we have an awesome show in store for you with really just a great American hero, also known as the Conscience of Psychiatry, Dr. Peter Breggin. Breggin.com is the website. He is the author of so many amazing books. Of course, The Conscience of Psychiatry, which we'll be talking about tonight. Just to list a few of them, Medication Madness, which is the role of psychiatric drugs in cases of violence, suicide, and murder. Brain-disabling treatments in psychiatry, about drugs, electroshock, and psychopharmaceutical complex. Your drug may be your problem. This will teach you how and why to stop taking psychiatric medications. The Heart of Being Helpful, Empathy, and the Creation of a Healing Presence. Dimensions of Empathic Therapy, the Antidepressant Fact Book, which your doctor won't tell you about Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa, Luvox, and more. Toxic Psychiatry, The War Against Children of Color, Talking Back to Ritalin, the Ritalin Fact Book, Talking Back to Prozac, and psychosocial approaches to deeply disturbed persons, Beyond Conflict, from self-help and psychotherapy to peacemaking, and Reclaiming Our Children, a healing plan for a nation in crisis. Of course, his latest book is Wow, I'm an American, How to Live Like Our Nation's Heroic Founders. It's such a pleasure to have you here tonight, Dr. Breggin. How you doing?
I'm doing good. It's good to hear your energetic voice on your energetic station.
Oh, well, thank you. And you, too. I just love hearing your voice. You just have such a gentle approach, and your desire for healing and understanding and compassion and empathy just really, really shines through. You're definitely a hero of ours here.
Well, thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. What would you like to talk about tonight?
Well, goodness, I mentioned your books in the intro, almost took up the whole intro. Yet, as I mentioned, you have quite a career, over 50 years in psychiatry. I'd like to talk about kind of how you got into it and where it was that you saw things weren't exactly as you thought when you first entered this profession.
Well, I got started as an 18-year-old college student at Harvard in 1954. Before the vast majority of your listeners were born, I'm certain of that. And I was just sitting around studying as a freshman, and a friend came by and said, let's go out and volunteer at the State Mental Hospital. His brother had actually just started a program. And I went to the state hospital with him. I had no intention of majoring in psychology. I was going to be a professor of American history and literature. That was what I thought I might become. And when I got out to the hospital, which was one of these old state mental hospitals in Waltham, Mass., metropolitan state, high up on a hill, outside of town, old buildings with heavy wire, cage windows, the usual. And I went on to the wards. I was overwhelmed by the squalor and the suffering and the disregard for common humanity of the people on the ward. I still have those images in my head. And I just couldn't believe that these people should be treated the way they were being treated. You know, you ask the doctors what they thought, and the doctors would say, well, they're schizophrenics, they don't care about their surroundings. They're not sensitive.
Wow.
And, you know,
isn't that amazing? Because You know, if you think of somebody who is supposedly mentally ill, you would think that order, compassion or empathy would be in order, not treating them like caged animals.
Well, empathy has never been the quality of psychiatry. You know, psychiatry began in the state mental hospital system. Everywhere that there was an industrial revolution and people were came into the big urban centers from the farms and from the villages, and there was overcrowding and poverty and disease and misery, they set up these giant institutions that were half madhouse and half pauper's house, and that continued then everywhere in the Western world where there was industrialization and urbanization. There would be the not a safety net, but a real incarceration center. And then eventually they got rid of the concept of poorhouses. But even so, the main characteristic of people who landed in the state mental hospitals when they were reaching their height in the 50s and early 60s, we had hospitals with 13,000 people in them, big villages, small cities really. They were mainly poor people, but, a lot of them were old, a lot of them were also very disturbed people. And the things that have been done to people by psychiatry in these hospitals have been atrocious. You go back in history and you have whipping and spinning and dunking and boiling and blistering and all kinds of toxins being given in purgatives and things like that. And then in the 1930s, psychiatry caught on that the way to subdue this population of people is actually to attack the brain. And you get lobotomy and electroshock, frank efforts to batter and harm the brain so badly that people would be controllable. It was hardly even masked as a treatment. The idea, it was called treatment, but nobody really took it seriously as treatment. These were ways of controlling people.
Well, because they were already branded as mentally ill or less than, so I guess people just weren't fighting for them. They just kind of turned a blind eye.
Well, here I am. I'm a college freshman. I ended up running the program. We did a lot of innovative things, but I walked into this situation untrained, and the way it struck me was it really struck me as it reminded me of my Uncle Dutch's descriptions of liberating a concentration or an extermination camp in World War II. The stench, the horrific squalor, the people looking so dreadful, the abusive aides and attendants, the arrogant, aloof doctors who barely set foot on the wards except the triage who'd get lobotomized, who'd get drugged, who'd get shock treatment. And I walked into that setting, and within a year, we had these programs going. We were actually getting patients out of the hospital. I discovered, my fellow students discovered, that if you gave a lot of attention, by which we meant like an afternoon a week or half an afternoon a week, to people, it really made a difference in their lives. And we even set up a special program where we showed we could get people out of the hospital who'd been in there for years and were lost causes. So very early on, I learned, before I was trained, that all these horrific treatments were doing far more harm than good, that the people who they were being inflicted on were essentially no different than me. They might have had tougher times or been in worse shape at one time or another, but to me, being a young kid, they were just people like me. And that drew me into psychiatry. The fact that I was having an impact as a young man, that I was developing these new programs. But by the time I then got through with my medical training and started into psychiatry, we're now in the 1966, 67, 68, any semblance of a humane psychiatry, an alternative social or psychological psychiatry, was being wiped out. And psychiatry was deciding to go, for its own interest, totally biologic. And by the early 1970s, there was essentially no more psychological or social psychiatry, and it was all biologic. And there was hardly any place for me, and So instead of, I was at the top of the profession. After I finished my training at Harvard and at State University of New York and Syracuse, and I went to the National Institute of Mental Health. I had a plum of a job. But at that point, I could see that literally psychiatry had gone totally mechanistic, biological, and genetic in its thinking, that there was no empathic response to human beings at all. And I ended up going into private practice, which I never thought I would do. I thought I'd be a professor or something like that. Mm-hmm. Then, just to put a little cap on this phase of the story, then in about 1971, I'd been in practice a few years, I found out lobotomy was coming back. And I got so appalled and then outraged that I decided to conduct a campaign to stop it. And I figured there'd be some psychiatrists would certainly come to my side. Maybe the Psychiatric Association would be glad somebody was standing up against lobotomy or whatever. And what happened is that the whole profession just turned on me. How dare you criticize one of our treatments? How dare you say a treatment's unethical as well as unscientific? Who are you, upstart? Shut up, sit down. Mm-hmm. And that began my, at times, very hazardous reform career.
Well, you didn't sit down and you didn't shut up.
Right.
Are you saying that not one other professional would stand with you?
Not a single person in any kind of position of authority in the profession. No outstanding professors. At one point, when I was really under attack in '85, some of the professors from where I was trained partly, came forward and said, "This is a good man. You should, you can't attack his medical license." But basically, the entire profession was lockstep, like an iron curtain, refusing to allow for any criticism, even of lobotomy. And at the time, this really did baffle me. Why was I being really attacked by the Psychiatric Association, the AMA? Why are they doing that? And then it gradually dawned on me that if I could define lobotomy as an inherent evil and unscientific, from both positions, the ethical and the scientific, well, what about shock treatment? That would be next. And then what about the antipsychotic drugs which cause chemical lobotomies? So that was the beginning. And now I'm 73 years old. I've been doing it for a long time. I'm actually starting a new organization now. I've been working with an organization that I founded for decades, but I'm starting a new organization now called, right now it's empathictherapy.org. I want to broaden it, not just, to the critique of psychiatric model, the biological genetic model and the drugs, but also to the notion of what is the alternative, what is a genuinely caring, wise, and useful approach to human beings. So just for lack of a better name, or maybe because it's a good name, I'm calling it empathic therapy.
That's a beautiful name.
And you can go to the empathic therapy, you can go to empathictherapy.org and see the beginnings of the new organization, as well as going to my website, Breggin.com, BREGGIN.com, and kind of see my life's work and my books and my videos and the tapes and stuff like that, including really up-to-date things. But I'm going to do more and more to try to train people and direct young people. It won't happen in psychiatry, though, because psychiatrists know that as physicians, they've got to be mechanical and chemical and biological in order to maintain their authority as physicians, because if they admit that the real issues begin with empathy and not biochemistry, why go to a physician instead of to an empathic counselor or psychologist or social worker? So to try to keep control psychiatry and their income, they have to imagine that it's actually the highest form of treatment is a 10-minute medication check, so you can see 5 or 6 patients an hour and make a heck of a lot more, or run a ward, or give shock treatment, make a lot more money.
Mm-hmm.
So the hope has got to be with the other professions, I believe, rather than psychiatry.
Well, speaking of the profession, of course, there are those that say, oh, yes, this is a founded science, and then there's the other side that says there is no shred of scientific evidence or behind these mental illnesses or diagnoses. And so what's the truth about that? Is there really any science backing this industry?
No, there isn't. It's a billion-dollar industry. It's power. It's authority. That's why they had to try to do me in when I was a young man, saying lobotomy was no good because I had feet of sand.
Wow.
And if I could criticize lobotomy in principle, then why not everything else as well? If I thought people with so-called schizophrenia were human beings who needed human contact to be brought back into relationship with people, to be brought back into society, if I was right, then they had no basis for their profession. So so they had to use power, and I think it really comes down to that. My area that I get the most upset about is the diagnosing and drugging of our children, and if you just use that as a model, it becomes particularly ghastly and absurd. You think about diagnosing a child who doesn't like school or who doesn't concentrate well on school or who's undisciplined or maybe...
Who doesn't want to read on the weekend.
Yeah, right. Or, maybe he's got problems at home and so he's nervous in school and doesn't... Whatever it is, to take all those children, the millions of children who either don't fit in the school or school doesn't fit them or whatever, and to say they have, quote, ADHD, and to give them addictive substances that are street drugs like amphetamine and Ritalin, and to numb their brains so that they'll sit down and shut up, because they are just sit down and shut up drugs. They cause apathy and they cause obsessive behaviors. They constrict the brain, the imagination, spontaneous behavior. I've documented it so clearly in all of my books, talking back to Ritalin, for example, in the Ritalin Fact Book. There's no question about what the drugs do. They do it to animals. And to think that this country has millions of children that we're numbing to get them to conform to boring, rote activities, it's a national, international now catastrophe.
Absolutely.
And the diagnosis, as you know, the diagnosis of ADHD, it's just a list of things that teachers need to pay. The reason that it grew so well, this diagnosis, in the educational field, because if you saw a kid who was a little irritable in class or wasn't paying attention or was jumping around or not, showing some need for attention or discipline, you could say, oh, that's not my problem, it's ADHD.
Let me get this straight. We're talking to a psychiatrist here, and you just said that there is basically no scientific basis supporting this so-called science.
That's right. There is basically no scientific basis. No so-called psychiatric disorder, like so-called major depressive disorder. Certainly people get depressed, but there's no evidence that that's genetic. Same thing with so-called schizophrenia, where people get, certainly people get very disturbed and irrational and become nightmarish in their internal experiences, but there's no evidence that that's genetic or biochemical.
Gosh, I mean, isn't something like depression normal? Like, if your dog dies, okay, and you're not depressed, now that would probably be cause for concern, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, my goodness. Let's take this caller. Area code 815. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, when you disagree with a psychiatrist, you're being argumentative. But when a psychiatrist disagrees with you,
you're in trouble.
No, that's acceptable. Why is that?
I'd say it's worse than that. You know, when you disagree with a psychiatrist, you're in trouble.
Okay.
I would not advocate disagreeing strongly with your psychiatrist.
But aren't you entitled to your own opinion?
Absolutely, you're entitled to your own opinion.
And if yours differs from his, then you're wrong.
Well, you know, it's a part of the authority structure. One of the most dangerous things you can do is to tell a psychiatrist you don't want to take psychiatric drugs, for example. It's like defying a religious sacrament in a religious state. It's a very, very serious problem. It's hard for people to find a psychiatrist that they can actually go and talk to. Psychiatrists aren't trained to talk anymore. They're not trained to do therapy anymore. They literally are trained to diagnose you from the words that come out of your mouth as quickly as possible, as expeditiously as possible, and to give you a drug shock treatment or a mental hospital.
True.
When I used to still be talking to young psychiatrists, they would get very, very upset with me when I suggested that you actually could talk to somebody who was very unhappy and very disturbed and help them a huge amount by being present, sharing some wisdom, but mainly making some human contact. Psychiatry is in a very egocentric position now where everybody they see, they have a pigeonhole for. That's what my colleagues are doing, and they have a drug for it. The drug doesn't work, so they give another one. That doesn't work, they give another one.
They use as guinea pigs.
Well, in a way, it's very true, because once you give a person 2 drugs at once, there haven't been many studies to verify that. Then you give them 3, 4, 5 drugs at once. You're experimenting with this very, very delicate organ called the human brain, and you're putting toxins into it. But let me say that these drugs change the brain, and so it's very dangerous to stop them abruptly. And I always remind people that it's not only dangerous to start these drugs, it's dangerous to stop them. And you have to be very careful, and if you've been on them for a few months or more, you need to have careful withdrawal, and hopefully with some kind of clinical supervision you can trust and your family behind you.
All right. Did you have any other questions or comments for Dr. Breggin tonight?
No, that should do it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for calling in. You know, very good point. I just, you know, well, okay, most everyone knows here. I just had a little bout, another setup frame situation that involved me spending a few days in the jail cell. And, I mean, all of them were medicated, too. And, Dr. Breggin, can I tell you the looks I got when I told them, nope, I don't do drugs, I'm not touching your stuff, you know, like there was something wrong with me. And, you know, there was a series of questions, so I just said, okay, it's against my religion. Oh, well, what religion is you? Or are you? And, you know, it's just really sad to see how dependent an entire society has become on toxic substance we know don't work. I mean, not only do they not work, they're causing a whole other host of situations, as you've described, in violence and suicidal and homicidal behavior and things that never used to be associated with things like depression or anxiety or bipolar or even schizophrenia, for that matter.
Yeah, you know, my book, Medication Madness, has 50 cases that I go into great detail that I personally evaluated, went to the crime scenes in some cases, saw them, all the medical records, police records, clinical records, school records, of 50 individuals who, on psychiatric drugs, committed or nearly committed violence, crime, and suicide. The drugs disrupt biochemistry, and when you disrupt the biochemistry of the brain, people can lose control of their behaviors. They can lose control of their mind, because the vehicle of the mind, the brain, is being so distorted and disrupted. And And we have a great deal of violence and suicide associated with these drugs. That was the whole purpose in my taking. It was really a lot of effort to go through all the cases that I've seen over the years, over 100 cases. I ended up reviewing and really going in depth in 50 of them. Now, if you read Medication Madness, you'll come away with a deep respect for how dangerous it is to tamper with the brain.
Mm-hmm. You know, I just posted a link in the text chat to an article you wrote, Psychiatric Drug Adverse Reactions and Medication Spellbinding. And I'd like to read just the first paragraph here, you know, and the link, of course, is over at TruthBrigade.com, but it reads as, Dr. Breggin's new concept of medication spellbinding provides insights into why so many people take psychiatric drugs when the drugs are doing more harm than good. Psychiatric drugs and all other drugs that affect the mind spellbind the individual by masking their adverse mental effects from the individual taking the drugs. If the person experiences a mental side effect, such as anger or sadness, he or she is likely to attribute it to something other than the drug, perhaps blaming it on a loved one or on their own mental illness. Often, people taking psychiatric drugs claim to feel better than ever, when in reality their mental life and behavior is impaired. In the extreme, medication spellbinding leads otherwise well-functioning and ethical individuals to commit criminal acts, violence, or suicide. Now, this is just so scary, but so true. And we mentioned before we went to break, is how people will just use it as a lack of responsibility or use it as a crutch. Oh, well, I was diagnosed with this so-called illness, so, you know, I'm allowed to overreact or act out, or I don't have to temper my anger, or, you know, and of course the parents or the teachers using it as an excuse. And it's just, do you see a way that we can actually get away from this programming?
Well, I've been spending a lifetime on that one.
Yeah.
I think that at the heart of the problem is the issue of personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
When I was younger, I even wrote a book about 30 years ago where I said no biochemical can make a person do anything. You know, alcohol or marijuana or LSD or psychiatric drugs can't make you do something you don't want to do. And so I'm a deep believer in personal responsibility, and the heart of the therapy I do combines empathy for the individual and helping the person take responsibility for their lives. But then science, and the science of pharmacology again and again showed me that despite my belief, if you give 10 people a psychiatric drug and 10 people get a placebo, the 10 people on the psychiatric drug are going to have a lot of mental disturbances. That when you disrupt the chemistry of the brain, activity becomes much more unpredictable, much more disturbed. It's much more difficult for the person to maintain rationality. And it's particularly difficult with a psychiatric drug, say, compared to alcohol, because when you drink alcohol, you know you're responsible for your behavior. You've heard again and again that alcohol leads to violent acts, that alcohol leads to depression, that alcohol leads to impaired driving, and so on, and in difficulties with impulse control. So you're supposed to know to control that and not drink too much and rely on your friends and other people's judgment. But when you take a psychiatric drug, you're rarely given a warning, the kind of warning you should get. And the result of that is you're not prepared for the changes that go on in your brain, your feelings, your mood. So you tend much more to attach it to reality.
Mm-hmm.
But even no matter how well you're informed, there's also this that it becomes difficult. I mean, in Medication Madness, I've got a couple of physicians, a psychiatrist and then one or two other kinds of doctors who knew about the risks of psychiatric drugs, particularly the psychiatrists, and yet they still lost control of themselves on stimulants and antidepressants. And the psychiatrist that I described in the book actually attacked a colleague with a hammer.
Wow.
And did it in a very bizarre and manic fashion, stimulated over the top by antidepressant drugs. So even knowledge won't necessarily protect you. And it was not easy for me to come to that conclusion, because I'm a deep believer in responsibility. And in fact, I've written my latest book is a book about, it's called Wow, I'm an American, and it's about learning from our founding mothers and fathers, our founding families, how to take responsibility for our lives, how to defend freedom, enjoy freedom, protect freedom, and take responsibility for our lives. So I deeply believe in this, but an impaired brain makes it very difficult for human beings to do that. And if they're taken off guard and by surprise by it, they can often end up doing things that they would never ordinarily do.
Absolutely. I mean, gosh, I have so much to say and don't even know where to start here. But you know what really... they're covering this up. They're covering up the research, the true evidence of the violent reactions and what's going on in the brain. And the fact is, they even, if you want to be a pilot, for instance, if you have ever taken one of these drugs, you are not allowed to fly. So they know that it's bad. They're just not telling the people. But it's that time, so we're going to take a short break. We will be right back with Dr. Peter Breggin on Truth Brigade Radio. We have a few questions here in the text chat I'm going to get to in just a minute, but I'd like to... let me ask you this. First of all, I've been to the NIMH.gov and looked at all of the statistics of people they claim are diagnosed with these mental illnesses and being drugged for. When I added up the totals, it equaled 175.6 million people. That's over half the population. What I would like to know is about the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. What criteria, what is being used to base these diagnoses on?
Well, it's very straightforward. The main criteria is that the people on the committees take money from drug companies.
And then they sit around the table and vote?
That's right. That is literally what's going on. A recent study showed that in critical areas like affective disorders, the depression and things like that, 100% of the panel members were involved with the drug companies, and overall, through all the categories, the vast majority were heavily involved with drug companies. That's this very long, powerful reach of the drug companies into every aspect of the professional life in the mental health field in this country, and then into the public life too, through the professionals, through the ads now on television and radio and so on, and also in the doctor's offices now, the television screens that are putting on the educational shows, which are actually drug company sales shows. So, I mean, it really is important to understand that the people who make these diagnoses are attempting to create cookie-cutter categories that will justify giving medications to people in the easiest, most facile sort of way by general practitioners, internists, pediatricians, and probably least in number in many ways, the psychiatrists. There's very little science to all of this. Certainly no one denies that some kids are out of control and some kids are angry and some people have obsessions and compulsions, and some people hear voices. But these very, very artificial categories into which human beings are divided up, I believe, do more harm than good. I mean, I have to use them when I'm communicating in court. I have to use as a forensic expert, a medical expert, I have to use these categories. But in reality, they often do much more harm than good. And in my own practice, I just think about the individual person. relating to a particular person, Jane or Jim or Jake, and I'm trying to understand their background, their story, their pain and suffering, their mistakes, why they're in trouble now, what they need to learn, to grow, to empower themselves, to take charge of their lives, to become more productive, more loving, happier people. And that is just not the model for psychiatry. It's not a growth model. It's not a help the person get rid of these emotional restraints, the guilt, the shame, the anxiety, the anger, the apathy. Get rid of these emotional restraints and grow to be creative and loving and caring and involved in life. It's all about suppressing symptoms, and in effect, you just suppress the human spirit. You can't suppress a compulsion. You can't suppress a behavior. You can't suppress a deluded idea or whatever without just suppressing the brain. I mean, it's as simple as that. So.
So basically, the DSM is just a set of behavioral traits that some guys who have ties with the drug companies sit around the table and vote on, perhaps maybe least desirable characteristics or whatever they happen to don't like. And so when you go see a psychiatrist, you are being diagnosed solely on the opinion of that psychiatrist.
Well, it's always that. That's right. I mean, it's not like there's a blood test that the people agree upon, or at least can discuss just how high a blood sugar is dangerous, or how low a blood sugar, or how high a blood pressure, or how low a blood pressure is dangerous, and what the norm is. It's nothing like that. It's a matter of opinion and judgment, and the basic book of judgment is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which has the pretension of trying to be scientific when there's very little science behind it, and very little is used,
if any,
in making the diagnostic categories.
Yeah, it sounds real scientific,
right.
And but you know, it reminds me of the movie Psychiatry, Industry of Death. If you have not seen that, I highly recommend it. But essentially, the same patient goes to like a dozen different psychiatrists and got completely different diagnoses and prescriptions.
Oh, yeah.
He told him he had the same symptoms. Every one of them got the same story, but they all had a different answer and a different drug.
Yeah, I think it may be drawing on a study that went in the 70s that nobody had the courage to repeat, by a fellow named Rosenhan, who sent a bunch of volunteer people, many of them professionals, students, and professional people, into an emergency room, and to say that they were hearing a voice saying hollow, I think it was. I don't remember exactly, but I think that's what the voice said. And they all got put into the hospital, and they all got diagnoses, and they all got drugs. None of them took the drugs. And all the patients knew they weren't mentally disturbed, but all the doctors thought they were.
Wow. Hold that thought there, Dr. Breggin. It's that time again. We have a real short segment here, so we'll just jump right in.
Well, can I bring something into the segment?
Please.
You mentioned earlier that these drugs were so bad that pilots couldn't use them. And indeed, I was an expert for the FAA and helped them argue that pilots shouldn't be using antidepressants, but they have now reversed themselves within the last week or two. And the FAA now is going to allow your pilot to be taking antidepressants, drugs that disinhibit, cause mania, cause depression, cause violence. Pilots are going to be allowed to use antidepressants now.
Yeah, and we're supposed to be afraid of hijackers on our planes, and you know, any one of these people on drugs are capable of the same. I don't know which is worse. I mean, I remember being a kid, I wanted to be a pilot. That was one of my goals, and here I am looking in the books, and you know, I found that I was automatically disqualified from ever flying because of a drug that they had given me as a young teenager. But I don't know which is worse, that, losing your dreams because you can't fly on drugs, or knowing that everyone can be flying on drugs.
Well, I do not believe that pilots should be taking psychoactive agents. Their effects on the brain are unpredictable, and if somebody is so depressed that they feel they can't fly be a pilot without an antidepressant, I have deep sympathy for them, but they shouldn't be flying an airplane. And the irony is that if you try to show that antidepressants work, it's very, very difficult. Study after study shows them to be little better or no better than placebos, whereas it's very easy to show that they cause mental disturbances because that turns up in every single study that's done. So, I think we would be better off without these drugs. I recently testified before Congress for the Veterans Affairs Committee. You can see that on my website on breggin.com, breggin.com. You can see the video. I'm the lead-off presenter, and I talked for half an hour to the Veterans Affairs Committee about why they shouldn't be giving these drugs to the military. So it's particularly ironic that we're going to give them to pilots now.
Yeah, give it to them while they're there, and then push it to give it to them when they get home, and it's just insane. Let me, ask you this. Speaking of numbers, you mentioned children. How many children are being drugged? Do we have an exact number or percentage on that?
No, but it's probably in the several million at least, just on the stimulants. So nobody really knows, but I'll bet it's around 10% of our kids at least that are getting some kind of a psychiatric drug. And if you go into special classes or you go into foster care or any kind of government control over kids, you're going to find that 50 to 100% are going to be on these psychiatric drugs. There's a huge scandal now in Florida about some Medicaid psychiatrists who have been just overwhelming the children in their care with psychiatric drugs with disastrous results. But I don't know a good figure on what percentages of American children, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 10 or 15% now.
I did find some statistics for children in foster care covered by Medicaid, but yeah, in fact, I hear the music, but when we come back, I will read that, I will share that, and prepare to be seated. We will be right back. Truth Brigade Radio. Dr. Breggin, about those drugs in foster care, this is a pretty, this subject is definitely very close to me right now. And so I found a study. It was actually published, the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and this article was about psychotropic medication patterns amongst youth in foster care. And, I'll just read a few bits and pieces here. It says, studies have revealed that youth in foster care covered by Medicaid insurance receive psychotropic medication at a rate of 3 times or greater than that of Medicaid-insured youth who qualify just by low family income. Systematic data on patterns of medication treatment, particularly concomitant drugs for youth in foster care, are limited. Okay, so the Medicaid data was assessed July 2004, random samples on medicated youth in foster care, age 0 to 19 years old, from the southwestern United States. The results were, of the foster children who had been dispensed psychotropic medication, 43.1% received more than 3 different classes of these drugs. There were
3?
Or 3 or more different classes.
Wow.
Yeah, 3 or more different classes of these drugs during July 2004. 15.9% received 4 or more. The most frequently used medications were antidepressants at 56.8%, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder drugs at 55.9%, antipsychotic agents at 53.2%, and says psychiatrists prescribe 93% of the psychotropic medication dispensed to youth in foster care. Wow, 93% of the medications dispensed to youth are in foster care. That just really makes my heart drop. And, you know, of course, we've seen where there's children with up to 17 different drugs. You know, I want to get to these questions I had in the chat here, and there was a statement that just really so true. One of the chatters shared with us, quote, "I went crazy on Paxil, haven't worked in 7 years, lost all childhood memories, short-term memory, and severe paranoia, living with my mom and dad again." I mean, just, you know, I'd like to hear about the long-term effects on the body of, you know, for those who have been on or off or were on in their youth and, you know, found out and quit taking them. What are the long-term effects, or can our body completely regenerate from the damages?
Well, you're asking a very, very broad question. Because there's so many different categories of drugs and they have so many different effects. But if we're just focusing on the brain, certainly the longer a person is exposed to the psychiatric drugs, the longer it's going to be and the harder it's going to be for the brain to recover. Now, some of the drugs are so toxic that there's no question about lasting damage and lasting changes. The antidepressant drugs actually distort the neuronal functions of the brain. They even cause something that we didn't think used to take place in the brain, neurogenesis. Antidepressant drugs will cause the growth of new brain cells, and they're not normal-looking cells. Now, psychiatrists, when they publish papers on this, and researchers, they're all funded, mostly funded by the drug companies, they say, well, see, this shows you the drugs work. When, of course, if they had a study showing marijuana caused new brain cell growth and the cells looked abnormal, it would be headlines for stopping smoking marijuana. But because it's a psychiatric drug, it's made out to be a good thing. We know that practically every psychiatric drug we look at in the laboratory has toxic effects on cells in general, including neurons. So it's just not a good thing to be doing to your brain for years and years. And psychiatrists who tell their patients, oh, you got to be on this for the rest of your life, it's just unethical and unmedical to tell that to somebody, because there are no studies of all your life. And the studies we do have tend to show that people recover better from psychiatric disturbances when they're not on medications for the rest of their lives. There are studies of the antipsychotic drugs, which are the ones, you know, they're supposed to treat the intractable, incurable schizophrenics and so on. Well, people labeled schizophrenic do better in cultures where there are no psychiatric drugs, and in our culture, they do better if they've stopped their drugs in the long run. So there are studies to show it, but the studies never get promoted, and the residents in psychiatry don't read them, and the public doesn't hear about them. But again, it's a high-risk thing to come off your drugs abruptly, and it's very, very important to do so with care and consideration as to what you're doing, and to be in a network that can support you in some way during the process, and clinical supervision, can be very, very important.
Yeah, so I guess the short-term memory loss, the long-term memory loss, the paranoia, what are some of the other side effects that people are experiencing on these drugs?
Well, again, it's so much a matter of which drug and how much exposure. When you get 2 and 3 drugs, you have no idea what the long-term effects are. But
okay, so we really don't know.
No, this is really... I mean, when you pour in these toxins into the brain, we have very little ability to know what in the world is going to happen long-term. But I'll give you some examples of the kinds of things that people have to deal with. If you're taking one of the neuroleptic drugs, the drugs like Risperdal, Zyprexa, Seroquel, and Abilify, they produce a shortened lifespan. They cause heart problems. They cause diabetes. They cause pancreatitis. They cause pathological obesity. And they cause a variety of neurological diseases, including neuroleptic malignant syndrome and tardive dyskinesia. Neuroleptic malignant syndrome is like very similar to encephalitis of the brain. It can be deadly. Tardive dyskinesia, chronic twitching spasms. It can be limited to the face or the tongue or the eyelids, or it can involve good portions of the body. It can be painful. These are dreadful disorders for drugs that really have very little utility other than this group of drugs. They're all lobotomizing agents. They produce apathy and indifference by lobotomizing. They're not treatments in the usual sense. They are harming the brain because somebody thinks it's a good result. Either the patient who becomes numb to the feelings and somehow in their agony thinks that's better, doesn't know there might be alternatives, or the family or the doctor who is more easily able to subdue or be around the patient. But none of these drugs really promote the growth of the individual or recovery. They interfere with genuine recovery.
Have any of these drugs, ever helped in a psychological so-called illness?
Well, you got to get rid of the idea of illness, because
of
things we treat in psychiatry, while they are real, it is real when a person loses touch with reality and imagines they're the Virgin Mary or thinks they're infected with foreign agents and aliens. I mean, there are emotional and psychological disturbances that can be very severe, but very few of them are biological in origin. And in fact, the only ones that are biological in origin that psychiatrists are likely to see are the ones they're causing with their drugs. That's the bitter irony. The only biochemical imbalance in the brain of the average person who sees a physician is the one the physician puts in there with a psychoactive substance. That's a bitter and terrible irony.
Oh, my goodness. And, of course, the answer is more drugs.
And we have better approaches. I mean, we know that people who are very disturbed respond to care, to relationship, to people who are willing to be patient with them and to guide them. We have a whole history of psychiatry called the moral era in the 17 and 1800s, where there were small hospitals, often run by Quakers, where physicians played little or no role, and where they used kindness and moral persuasion and did very well with very disturbed people. There are books about them. There's an old book by Tuke. I think he was the son of the original Tuke, T-U-K-E, who was a Quaker in Great Britain and ran this institute. And he had to fight the physicians who always wanted to take over and poison his patients. And he's talking about this. He's talking about this when he, I think it was the early 1800s. He's talking about this. The physicians want to poison the patients and give them toxic drugs, and they need kindness and restraint and care and good food and exercise and peaceful place to be. And this is now I'm talking about a book written, well more than a century ago, and he's talking about how the people who are the aides in these hospitals have to be taught to be patient and caring, and you don't hear that in a modern psychiatric hospital. They're told how to do restraints. Psychiatry is in very sad shape. It has become a mechanistic and suppressive, and that's exactly what the young docs are being taught. They have no idea that you can sit down with a disturbed human being and by your mere presence calm the person down. They have no idea.
Yeah, that's certainly not a way to heal, even if there really were scientifically proven mental illnesses. Let me ask you, there's a few more questions I copied from the text chat, and this one reads, quote, about schizophrenia, is it possible to treat without meds? It's easy to understand depression can be treated without meds, a little harder for bipolar, but still can reason it. Schizophrenia is scary. How do you treat that without meds? End quote.
Well, I started as a college volunteer in a state mental hospital, sitting on back wards, talking to very disturbed people, and finding that just my presence would calm them down, make them feel hopeful, and if
a little love.
Love, care, concern, some wisdom, a little guidance, a little help here and there. I mean, these people were confined. They needed help in getting things they needed. So we did a variety of different things for them. And then I found in my practice that, people having a first-time psychotic break, your 17-year-old who thinks mom's got horns and dad's with the CIA and is just all freaked out, and he comes into your office and you sit and you start to talk and you start to listen to beneath what they're saying about what's happening with their mother and father and how they're seeing mom abused by dad or how they're feeling neglected or rejected or even sexually abused, and you get into what is the life experience behind the nightmare that's been diagnosed by somebody else as schizophrenia, this nightmare, what this is, and you can actually help bring people through this remarkably quickly when they have never been drugged, never been locked up, and never been intimidated by a psychiatrist, where they don't have all those handicaps. You can sometimes help a person in a few sessions begin to get back to reality when they're a young person having a break. Your average psychiatrist, he never heard of this. Your average psychiatrist, when he's trained, hardly ever sees an unmedicated, disturbed patient because they've already been medicated in the ER before they get to him, or he's medicated in the ER in the first 15 minutes. So they don't even have the experience of what it's like to talk to a human being. Now, they'll see people who stop their drugs and who get horrible withdrawal reactions, but they don't even know, these doctors don't know they're looking at withdrawal reactions.
Wow.
So they have no idea how to relate. And this was already happening. So I took my first year of training at Harvard in 1962-63, and 63-64. And Harvard was advanced, way ahead of everybody else. So they were already giving up their psychological and social approaches. They were already drugging their patients. So all the young residents were drugging their patients. They'd never worked in a state hospital like I had. They'd never had experience with disturbed people before, so they had no idea you could sit with a disturbed person and calm them down. So they just drug them when they came in. And I'd be on night duty, and all the patients would come out of their rooms, and they'd sit around, and they want to talk to me because I knew how to talk to somebody who was freaked out and how to give them a certain amount of security and peace and trust and start a conversation about what they needed to do to get themselves better. But the young psychiatrists around me had no idea, and they never would.
When you're being treated like an animal, and I'm not saying that animals should be treated this way because they shouldn't. No living thing should be treated that way. But, a little humanity can do wonders. Obviously you see it in your practice.
All the time.
You've been working alternative and more integrative methods in your approach and your practice over the years. It's just such a sad subject.
Psychiatry is so aberrant in what it's doing that if you actually imagine doing it to animals, there would be outrage throughout the country. Can you imagine if there was a polar bear that was depressed in captivity and the public found out we were giving them electroshock?
Yeah.
Or if there was a polar bear in captivity who got very obsessive compulsive and was gnawing on the bars of his cage and chewing on his feet, and we gave him a lobotomy. Can you imagine the public outrage?
Mm-hmm.
Or if all the little pups being born to the wolves and who just didn't like being confined. Did we put them all on stimulant drugs to make them zone out? Can you imagine? People would not put up with treating animals in a zoo the way we treat people. And in fact, there was
save the whales, kill the babies. I mean, it's so true what you're saying.
There you go.
You know, there's a few more subjects here I'd like to try to go over now. Forced drugging, people being court-ordered to take their medication, and, of course, we touched on foster homes and such, but yesterday, a woman whose children were stolen, and, of course, they were trying to cover up their medical negligence and drugging. She was just arrested yesterday for sending a birthday card to her own son.
Was she a woman who was resisting the psychiatric drugging of her kids?
She didn't want to take the drugs.
She didn't want to take drugs. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
There's a lot of that goes on now. Outpatient, people don't realize, but it's probably most states now. I don't know the exact data. You can actually be committed outpatient so that your home becomes your mental hospital. Mm-hmm. And if you don't show up in 2 weeks or every week, it depends on the drug. Let's say you're getting a weekly shot that lasts all week. It paralyzes your brain all week and literally, just immobilizes your emotionality and even your body to some extent. And if you don't show up for your shot every week, they can send people out to hold you down and give it to you right in your own home. It's called outpatient commitment.
Wow.
And the drug companies and organizations that are promoted and paid for by the drug companies like NAMI, National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, promote these things. It's just one more travesty. In America, we still have a reasonable amount of freedom unless you're declared a mental patient, and then you lose your civil liberties. You're no longer really an American.
Isn't that the truth? Now, I've seen it time and again, people being court-ordered to take medications, whether it's their political or religious beliefs, or they homeschool, or they believe they don't need drugs and doctors. Oh my, those dangerously ill people. What if you are in a situation where they are trying to have you drugged or go to one of their court representative psychiatrists and court ordered to take medication? What would you recommend?
Well, I think there's two things to look at. One, of course, is getting a lawyer if you can. There aren't that many pro bono or sort of public law groups anymore. There, you can get in touch. I'm trying to remember the name of some of the networks that are out there on the web, and get in touch with some people who have been through these kinds of experiences. The most important thing you can do is get your own act together. I mean, some people will resent my saying that, but that's the single most important thing you can do, is to learn to take care of yourself, so that you're not getting into trouble with these authorities, so that you can stay away from them, mind your own business, and take care of your life in a,
Well, unfortunately, not everyone being forced drugged actually has problems. It's, clearly being used as a political tool of social control, as a way to have power over people.
Yeah, I got what you're saying. And it's a complicated and difficult discussion, but I think the most important thing is to realize that you got to find a way to take charge of your life, that you're free of this oppressive psychiatric system, because once you allow it to get its grips on you, it can be, you can be forced into hospitals, you can be forced into medication, and I'm against that. I am totally 100% against involuntary psychiatric treatment.
Okay, now if this was brought up in one's life and they were either court-ordered, and see, the thing is, you don't have to take one of these court representative psychiatrist, you can pay for your own and get an unbiased opinion. Is there perhaps a network of psychiatrists that one could call, in any state, where they could get hooked up with a network?
No, there is no network. There is no network of psychiatrists. Okay. There's an individual here and an individual there. There is no network of psychiatrists because psychiatry depends upon the use of drugs and involuntary treatment for its power and its authority. But
okay, so one would basically just have to look around and interview each individual.
You need a lawyer to begin with, and there just aren't a lot of us who are willing to do this kind of work because it runs counter to where the power and influence of our profession comes from. And any time you have a profession entrenched in a certain way of life, whether it's the southern slave states and slavery, or whether it's men holding women as property for centuries, their wives as property for centuries, wherever you have entrenched power models, they are not readily given up by whoever holds the power. And psychiatry is a very entrenched system of power with involuntary treatment, with the use of these really brain-disabling agents. If we weren't so caught up with drugging people and locking them up against their will, we could provide very successful havens for people. We've had them over the years in different countries around the world going back 2 centuries, but psychiatry always closes them down because they undermine the concept that you need to lock people up and drug them. We have the skills. There are individual counselors and therapists out there. Mostly they're sort of under the radar, minding their own business, helping people without sending them for drugs or sending them to mental hospitals. Mm-hmm. We do know how to help people, but the system of power that's now backed by this multi-billion-dollar huge pharmaceutical industry really has a grip on what we're loosely calling the mental health professions.
Thanks so much for joining us here tonight, Dr. Breggin.
Thanks for a lovely evening with you. I appreciate it very much. My
Always.
best to all of your audience.
Thank you so much. Abundant blessings and love to all. We will see you tomorrow night here at Truth Brigade Radio.